This story began in 2007 in Toronto, where a series of bank robberies were committed. But how this story ended shocked everyone. On October 20th, 2007 at 11 a.m., a guy wearing a hoodie walked into the CIBC Bank in Toronto. His right arm and face were wrapped in bandages. Approaching the counter, he handed the worker a piece of paper. The following was written on it: "I have a gun in my pocket. Hand me the cash you have. You shouldn't play with me." The cashier did not take any risks and gave the robber $155 Canadian. The guy took the money and left the bank building. None of the people around even noticed that a robbery had just happened. The arriving police were also unable to find the robber, and he managed to escape unpunished. Over the next 3 months, 5 more banks were robbed in a similar manner. The robber was either a man with his face wrapped in bandages or an old man with a thick beard. The largest amount that was taken out of the bank was $2,000 Canadian. It is unlikely that this money would be enough for the robbers for long, so the police assumed that they would not stop. The common handwriting, as well as fingerprints found at the crime scene, helped link these robberies. They were not in the police database, which meant that the robbers had no criminal history. All robberies occurred at banks located along the 401 road. Hoping to catch the criminals, the police took surveillance of the remaining banks located along this road that the robbers had not yet touched. However, this time a similar robbery was committed in a completely different place. The damage, as usual, was small, but 6 robberies carried out in such a primitive manner were a real shame for the police. This time the robber's car was caught on a surveillance camera. It was a new Ford model at that time. It was impossible to make out the license plate, but a Ford Canada representative said the model was only available at certain dealers and there weren't many of those cars in Toronto at the moment. It seemed logical to determine which dealership the car was purchased at. While the police were trying to do this, one of the patrolmen noticed what seemed to him to be the same wanted car. The patrolman followed him. The owner of the car turned out to be a young guy, Brett Ryan. He certainly wasn't the bearded old man, but he may have been the second person to carry out the robbery with his face covered in bandages. The police followed the guy for several days. He led a normal life for a young man, went to the gym, movies, restaurants, and saw friends. Nothing unusual was noticed in his behavior until June 9, 2008. On this day, Brett drove his car very slowly around the streets where several banks were located. At some of them, he stopped briefly and went inside. There was still no sign of the old man. However, the police requested a search warrant for his home and car, and it was not in vain. A note was found in Brett's house with the same text that the wanted robbers handed over to the cashiers: money, license plates that matched those stolen from banks, and a fake gun. There was no doubt Brett Ryan was exactly what the cops were looking for. They found a guy hiding his face under bandages, but who was the old man with a thick beard who had committed similar robberies? The answer turned out to be simple. It was also Brett Ryan. Accessories used for theatrical makeup were found in his house. Sometimes during robberies, Brett played the role of a man with a broken arm and a damaged face. Sometimes he made himself up to look like an old man. Perhaps in the future he would have come up with new images if the police had not arrested him. Brett Ryan was born in Toronto. He had 3 brothers. The 2 oldest are Chris and Alexander, and the youngest is Lylan. Brett was a completely ordinary guy, cheerful, sociable, and kind. After graduating from school, Brett entered the University of Toronto. However, for some reason, he soon dropped out of university and began working as a painter. He didn't work for a specific company. He worked for himself. By submitting advertisements to various resources, he found people who wanted to restore the facade of the house, and thus, without receiving a higher education, he earned his living. Of course, the profession of a painter is very important. But watching his friends become lawyers, journalists, and programmers after graduating from universities, Brett, very fixated on his reputation, began to think that something was going wrong in his life. He wanted to work for a big company and earn big money. But instead, he had to do odd jobs painting houses in the area. Brett had one personality trait. He was very dependent on the opinions of others. At the age of 23, he continued to live with his parents. But so that others would see him as a successful guy, he bought expensive branded items that he clearly couldn't afford. That polish cost money, which Brett didn't have. This only drove him deeper and deeper into debt. Ultimately, by 2007, Brett had loans totaling over $20,000. At this point, instead of deciding to live through, Brett decided to rob a bank. As mentioned earlier, the first robbery was too easy for him, so he decided not to stop there. For his crimes, he faced 15 years in prison, but in court he made a speech that touched the judge. He looked remorseful. His parents and friends wrote countless letters in Brett's defense. The judge also took into account that the guy had not previously broken the law, and Brett was ultimately sentenced to 5 years in prison. He served only 2 years, and given his good behavior, he was released. He tried to return to his old profession related to landscaping the facades of houses. But of course, no one wanted to let a man convicted of theft near the house. He still lived with his parents. They, seeing that Brett's past was not allowing him to start a new life, decided to leave their large, wonderful house and move to the opposite part of Toronto, the Scarborough area. Yes, now they lived in a smaller house, but here almost no one knew about their son's past, and he had the opportunity to reassemble his life from the fragments into which it was broken at the moment. Brett was 30 years old by this time. He himself understood that he could not move further along the same road as before. He began visiting a psychologist who worked to ensure that the guy was honest with the people around him, so that he stopped seeming like someone he is not. In the new area, Brett returned to work on facade landscaping. Also, in addition to this, he returned to study at the University of Toronto. On October 10, 2011, Brett went on a blind date with a girl named Kirsten Baxter. The date was successful and the couple began a relationship. Kirsten had the normal life Brett had always dreamed of. She was a doctor, she had her own apartment, her own car, and she could also afford to travel a lot. 2 years after they met, Brett moved in with Kirsten. Now they began to live together and Brett's life was getting better. He continued to study at the university and also travel with Kirsten. In 2014, Brett and Kirsten got engaged. The engagement ring that Brett gave to his bride surprised many. It had a large diamond and clearly cost the guy a lot of money. In addition to this joyful event, in the same year a tragedy happened in Brett's life. Brett's father, Bill, died in 2014. This was a real blow to everyone in the family, but especially to Brett's mother, Sue. Soon there was a turning point in Brett's life. He got a job at an IT technology company. He changed his work uniform to a business suit and in his mind began to look like a successful guy. Brett's mother, Sue, was proud of him. Despite the past, her son was able to start his life anew. He had a prestigious job and also a beautiful bride. Brett's mother had often heard talk about how her son was a clueless guy, but now he rubbed the nose of everyone who said it. In October 2016, Brett and Kirsten planned to get married. They wanted to buy a new big house and had even hired a realtor for this. However, a few weeks before the wedding, Brett called his mother and said that he needed to talk to her. He came to her house and told her something that shocked her. In fact, Brett had been out of college for almost a year and dropped out for the second time. The job in the IT company that he told everyone about was also a lie. Yes, he actually got it, but after only a couple of weeks of work, the employer found out that Brett was serving time in prison for bank robbery and fired him. He could not admit this to Kirsten, and in recent months he only pretended to attend work. Every morning he woke up and allegedly got ready for work, kissed Kirsten and left the house. He spent time outside, hanging out until the evening. Then, as if nothing had happened, he returned home. That expensive ring that he gave to Kirsten was purchased on credit, and Brett is once again having big financial problems. The mother was the only person to whom the guy was able to confess his lies. He asked her for money to close the loan and prepare for the wedding. Sue was shocked as never before. Her idea that Brett's life was better was shattered, but this was her son and she couldn't help but help him. Sue said, "Okay, I'm willing to help you, but you have to tell your fiancé the truth. Kristen is a good girl and she will soon be your wife. She doesn't deserve these lies. If you don't do it, then I will." However, Brett had already decided for himself that this could not happen. As stated earlier, he couldn't afford to let his image as a successful guy be ruined, and he especially couldn't afford to risk his relationship with Kristen. Brett didn't say anything more to his mother that day. He drove home thinking about her ultimatum, but instead of admitting to his fiancée that he was lying, he chose another option, to kill his mother. He purchased a crossbow and hid it in the garage of his mother's house. Brett decided that everything should happen on August 25, 2016. But before heading to his mother's house, Brett needed to provide himself with an alibi. He turned on his laptop at home and wrote a program on it that would simulate activity on this laptop. The program was supposed to periodically switch videos on YouTube and also send emails. This way the laptop would imitate Brett's activity. Brett himself went to his mother's house. He tried one last time to convince her not to tell Kristen the truth, but Sue did not give in to his persuasion. When their argument gained momentum, Sue, Brad's mother, called his older brother Chris and asked him to come to her. This was not Brett's plan. He ran to the garage where the crossbow was hidden, but loading it was not so easy. While Brett skillfully tried to insert an arrow into the crossbow, his mother also ran into the garage. There was no turning back for him. He threw the crossbow and struck the mother twice with an arrow. She survived them. Then Brett began to choke her. After Brett realized that his mother was no longer showing signs of life, he began to think about what to do next. His brother Chris was due to arrive any minute. Time was limited. The guy loaded the crossbow and began to wait for his brother. Chris arrived soon after. He went into the house, but there was no one there. Then he went to the garage. Going inside, he saw his mother lying on the floor in a pool of blood. Running up to her, he was instantly shot in the neck. The arrow went right through and the guy died almost immediately. Now in the garage were the corpses of Brett's mother and brother. The whole garage was covered in blood. Brett began to think about how to clean it up and get rid of the two corpses. Minutes later, Brett was surprised to hear the sound of a car approaching. He looked out the window and saw his second brother, Alexander, driving up to the house. It was a complete failure, but he had already killed two people and now he could not retreat. Brett didn't wait for Alexander to enter the house. He walked out the back door of the garage and tried to hit his brother with an arrow in the street. A fight broke out, but Brett was stronger. He knocked Alexander to the ground and struck him several times with an arrow. Brett now had the deaths of his mother and two brothers on his hands. But this was not the end. As stated earlier, Brett was one of four brothers. The youngest brother, Leland, was sleeping in his mother's house at that time. He woke up to the sound of Brett and Alexander fighting. Leland came down to see what was happening, and at that moment Brett attacked him. Another fight began. Leland did not yet know that Brett had killed his mother and two brothers. The guy managed to run out of the house. He ran to his neighbors along the road, seeing Alexander bleeding. At that moment, he was seized with wild horror. The guy ran to the nearest house. The neighbors, hearing his mumbled story, immediately called the police. Upon arrival at the scene, police found Alexander lying on the road near the garage. To the surprise of many, he was still alive at that time, but by the time the ambulance arrived, he had died. The next person the police found was Brett. He was sitting on the steps of the house with a bottle of water in his hands. When he saw the police, he said they were in the garage. They were dead. It was me. Brett Ryan really managed to start a new life. His fiancée accepted him for who he was. She knew that he was in prison. With her, he didn't have to pretend to be something he wasn't. Surely she would have calmly accepted his dismissal from work. But Brett chose a different path, the path of lies. For the murder of 3 people, Brett Ryan was sentenced to 2 life sentences in prison. The lies in his life have led to the fact that he now has no bride. The very one he was afraid of losing. There is no family that always supported him. And we can say that, in principle, his normal life is now over. Thank you for your attention. Subscribe to the channel and click on the bell so as not to miss new videos.